When we think of ancient Greece, certain images come to mind. Perhaps marble columns standing against the Mediterranean sky. Philosophers debating in sunlit courtyards. Or maybe scenes from Hollywood films, togas, goblets of wine, and revelry that seems equal parts elegant and excessive. But what were Greek parties actually like? Not the sanitized versions we see in museums or the exaggerated fantasies of modern imagination, but the real gatherings where real people came together to drink, talk, and celebrate? Tonight we're going to step into those spaces. We'll walk through the doors of ancient homes, recline on couches beside Greek citizens, and discover what actually happened when the wine began to flow. Some of what we find will surprise you. Some will feel strangely familiar. And some will reveal just how different their world was from our own. This is the reality behind the symposium, the festival, and the feast. This is how ancient Greeks actually partied. The most famous form of Greek gathering was the symposium, a word that literally means drinking together. But if you're picturing a free-for-all celebration where anyone could show up and the wine flowed without restraint, you'd be mistaken. The symposium was something far more structured, far more exclusive, and in many ways, far stranger than we typically imagine. First, understand who was invited. A symposium was an event for adult male citizens, usually hosted in the andron, the men's room of a private home. Women of citizen status were not present. Neither were slaves except to serve. Neither were foreigners, unless they were specifically invited guests. The symposium was a space that reinforced social boundaries as much as it dissolved them through drink. The room itself would be relatively small, perhaps accommodating 7 to 15 men, though some larger homes could host more. The men didn't sit in chairs around a table. Instead, they reclined on couches called klinai, arranged along the walls of the room. Each couch typically held 2 men, lying on their left sides, propped up on cushions. This posture, borrowed from Eastern customs, was itself a mark of leisure and status. To recline while eating and drinking was to demonstrate that you were free, that you didn't need to hurry, that you had time for pleasure. Before the drinking even began, there was dinner. The deepnon, as it was called, involved courses of food, bread, cheese, olives, fish, occasionally meat from a sacrifice. The food was eaten with hands, and servants would bring water for washing between courses. But the meal itself wasn't the main event. It was a prelude. Once the food was cleared away, the symposium proper began. A symposiarch was chosen, a master of ceremonies, essentially, who would decide how strong the wine would be. Greek wine was never drunk pure. It was thick, almost syrupy, and always mixed with water in a large bowl called a krater. The ratio mattered enormously. Too much water, and the evening would be dull. Too little, and things could spiral out of control. The symposiarch held considerable power in setting the tone for the night. The mixed wine was then distributed in cups, usually shallow, wide vessels called kylixas. And here's where things begin to differ from modern drinking culture. The Greeks didn't sip casually throughout the evening. Instead, they drank in rounds, often accompanied by toasts or ritualized speeches. Before drinking, libations were poured, offerings to the gods. Hymns might be sung. There were rules, rhythms, formalities that governed even the act of getting drunk. Entertainment came in various forms. Sometimes there was music. A flute girl might play, though her presence was complicated by the fact that female musicians at symposia were often assumed to be available for more than just music. Sometimes there were games. Kataubos was a popular one, where drinkers would flick the dregs of their wine at a target, trying to knock it over. It sounds simple, perhaps even silly, but it was taken seriously, with winners earning small prizes and considerable bragging rights. But the most valued entertainment was conversation. The symposium was where ideas were exchanged, where politics were discussed, where philosophy happened. Plato's Symposium, one of the most famous philosophical texts in Western history, is set at exactly this kind of gathering, where Socrates and others take turns giving speeches about the nature of love. That wasn't pure fiction. Real symposia really did feature extended discussions, debates, storytelling, and poetry. Yet we shouldn't romanticize this too much. These same gatherings could turn rowdy, even violent. Men would get drunk, very drunk. Arguments could escalate into fights. The philosopher Alcibiades, in Plato's text, burst into the symposium late, already intoxicated, crowned with ivy and ribbons, demanding more wine. This was apparently not unusual behavior. The symposium, then, was a paradox. It was refined and cultured, a space for the highest intellectual pursuits. But it was also a place where social rules loosened, where men could express emotions and desires that everyday life kept constrained. It was exclusive and hierarchical, yet it created intimacy and connection. It was structured by ritual, yet it courted chaos. When we think of how Greeks partied, this is where we must begin, not with wild abandon, but with a carefully orchestrated evening that could contain both philosophy and drunken games, both religious observance and bawdy songs. The symposium was many things at once, and that complexity is part of what made it so central to Greek social life. To understand Greek parties, you must understand their relationship with wine. It was central to their culture, deeply embedded in their religion, and yet they approached it with a caution that might surprise us. The Greeks didn't celebrate drunkenness the way we sometimes imagine ancient peoples did. Instead, they practiced what we might call controlled intoxication, getting drunk, yes, but doing so within boundaries they considered civilized. The god Dionysus presided over wine, and his mythology tells us much about Greek attitudes. Dionysus was not a simple god of pleasure. He was dangerous, wild, associated with madness and loss of control. His followers, in myth, could be overtaken by divine frenzy, tearing animals, or people, apart with their bare hands. Wine, the Greeks understood, could liberate, but it could also destroy. It could bring joy, inspiration, and truth, but it could also bring violence, humiliation, and ruin. This is why they always mixed their wine with water. Always. To drink wine unmixed, akratos, they called it, was considered barbaric. It was something Scythians did, those northern peoples the Greeks regarded as uncivilized. A proper Greek would no more drink pure wine than he would eat raw meat. Both were signs of savagery, of being too close to the animal. The mixing ratios varied. 3 parts water to 2 parts wine was common. Sometimes it was 2 to 1, or even 3 to 1. Stronger mixtures existed for special occasions, but they were noted as unusual. The symposiarch's decision about the ratio was therefore crucial. He was essentially controlling how intoxicated everyone would become, setting the pace and intensity of the evening. But even with diluted wine, the Greeks drank substantial quantities. The evening involved multiple kraters being mixed and consumed. Men would drink cup after cup, round after round. They would get drunk, that was expected, even desired. But there was a line. To lose control completely, to vomit, to pass out, to become aggressive or maudlin, these were shameful. The ideal was to reach a state of euphrosyne, a kind of joyful, animated pleasure that heightened conversation and connection without descending into chaos. Various writers commented on this balance. The poet Eubulus, in a fragment preserved from a comedy, has Dionysus himself explain the proper amount of wine. 3 kraters, the god says. The first is for health, the second for love and pleasure, the third for sleep. After that, wise men go home. The 4th krater belongs to violence, the 5th to shouting, the 6th to revel, the 7th to black eyes, the 8th to summons, the 9th to vomiting, and the 10th to madness and furniture breaking. This wasn't just comedy. It reflected real social attitudes. There was a right amount to drink, and going beyond it made you look foolish or dangerous. The symposium structure, the mixing, the rounds, the oversight of the symposiarch, existed partly to help men navigate this line. We also have warnings about wine from philosophers. Plato argued that young men shouldn't drink at all until they were 18, and then only moderately until 30. Wine, he thought, inflamed the passions, and young men's passions were already too hot. Aristotle discussed how different people reacted differently to wine. Some became amorous, others belligerent, others silent and withdrawn. Yet for all these cautions, wine remained essential. It was how you honored guests. It was how you honored gods. It was the medium through which men bonded, through which ideas flowed, through which a certain kind of truth emerged. There was even a concept, parrhesia, frank speech, that was associated with wine. A drunk man, the Greeks believed, might say what he really thought, might reveal his true nature. In wine there is truth, they said, though they recognized this truth could be uncomfortable or dangerous. The relationship between Greeks and wine was thus sophisticated and ambivalent. They celebrated it and feared it. They built elaborate social structures around it precisely because they knew its power. When we imagine Greek parties, we shouldn't picture either total sobriety or complete drunkenness, but rather this delicate dance, men trying to find the sweet spot where wine loosened tongues and lifted spirits without pulling them under entirely. Now we must address something uncomfortable, something that changes how we view these gatherings. When we've been describing symposia, we've been describing events that excluded most of the population. Understanding who wasn't at the party tells us as much about Greek society as understanding who was. Women of citizen families, respectable women, wives and daughters, were not present at symposia. They lived in separate parts of the house, in the gynaekeon, the women's quarters. While their husbands reclined with friends, drinking and talking late into the night, these women remained in their own spaces. They had their own social world, their own gatherings, but we know far less about them because men did the writing. The women who did appear at symposia were different. Female musicians, flute girls, harp girls, were hired entertainment. They were usually slaves or free women, and their presence served multiple purposes. They provided music, certainly. But they were also available sexually, or at least expected to tolerate advances and crude behavior. Some of them appear in vase paintings, playing instruments while men recline, or sometimes in more explicit scenes. Their social position was precarious, their choices limited. There were also hetaira, courtesans, essentially, though that translation doesn't quite capture their status. These were women who had more freedom than respectable wives, who could attend symposia, who conversed with men, who were sometimes educated and witty. Some became famous. Aspasia, companion of Pericles, was known for her intelligence and political influence. But hetaira were still outside the bounds of respectability, still defined by their relationships with men, still vulnerable in ways that male citizens were not. The presence of these women, and the absence of wives and daughters, tells us something crucial about the symposium. It was a space where men could behave differently than they did in public or family settings. They could express desires, make crude jokes, engage in flirtation or more, without the constraints that governed interaction with respectable women. The symposium was a kind of release valve for a society with strict gender segregation. Slaves were everywhere in the Greek household, including at parties. They mixed the wine, served the food, played music, attended to the guests' needs. They were essential to the functioning of the symposium, yet they were also largely invisible in the way that service workers often are. When ancient writers described symposia, they rarely mentioned slaves except in passing, yet the whole event would have been impossible without their labor. The social dynamics were complex and uncomfortable. A citizen might recline next to another citizen as an equal, engaged in philosophical discussion. But both were being served by people who had no freedom, no choice, no voice in the conversation. The leisure that made the symposium possible, the time to recline and drink and talk, rested on the exploitation of enslaved labor. Children, too, were generally absent. The symposium was an adult space, Though very young boys might be present briefly, and adolescent boys might be included in certain circumstances, particularly if they were being courted by older men. This was another aspect of symposium culture that modern observers find difficult: the normalization of pederasty, of relationships between adult men and teenage boys. These relationships had structure and social rules, but they were relationships of unequal power, and the symposium was one setting where they unfolded. Foreigners could be guests, but their presence was always marked. The symposium reinforced boundaries between citizens and non-citizens, between Greeks and barbarians, between free and enslaved. It created intimacy within a select group by excluding everyone else. When we romanticize the symposium, when we imagine it as a space of democratic discourse and philosophical inquiry, we need to hold this exclusion in mind. The conversations we celebrate, the philosophical texts that emerged from these gatherings, were produced by a small elite who had the freedom, education, and leisure to participate. The insights they developed, the ideas they exchanged, were real and valuable. But they came from a profoundly unequal world. This doesn't mean we should dismiss the symposium or refuse to find anything of worth in it. But it means we should see it clearly, in its full context. The party was never just a party. It was also a performance of social hierarchy, a reinforcement of who mattered and who didn't, who spoke and who served, who was visible and who was invisible. The symposium was private, exclusive, controlled. But Greek life also included public festivals, events where the whole city celebrated together, where boundaries loosened, and where the experience of communal joy was open to almost everyone. These festivals were different in tone, scale, and purpose, and they reveal another side of how ancient Greeks partied. Athens alone celebrated around 60 festival days per year. Some were small local affairs. Others were major events that drew participants from across the Greek world. The Great Dionysia, for instance, was a week-long festival in honor of Dionysus that included theatrical performances, processions, and extensive feasting and drinking. The Panathenaea celebrated Athena with athletic competitions, musical contests, and a massive procession that wound through the city to present the goddess with a newly woven robe. These festivals mixed religious observance with entertainment and celebration in ways that might seem strange to us. A typical festival would begin with a sacrifice: animals slaughtered at an altar, their blood spilled for the gods, their meat roasted and distributed. This wasn't somber or grim. It was festive. The sacrifice was followed by feasting, often on a scale that ordinary people rarely experienced. Meat was precious in the ancient world, expensive and relatively rare. For many citizens, festival days were the main times they ate beef or pork. After the sacrifice and feast came other entertainments. Athletic competitions were common: running races, wrestling, boxing, events that tested strength and speed. Musical competitions featured performers playing lyres, flutes, singing songs. Theatrical performances, particularly at the Dionysia, presented tragedies and comedies, stories of gods and heroes, satires of contemporary life. These weren't just religious obligations. They were wildly popular, drawing crowds that cheered, laughed, wept, and argued about what they'd seen. Drinking was part of festivals, but it was more communal and less structured than at a symposium. There were processions where participants carried wine, sang hymns, wore costumes or garlands of ivy and flowers. There were komos, drunken reveries where groups of men, often young men, would roam through the streets singing, dancing, sometimes causing mischief. These komos could be boisterous, could verge on disorderly, but they were generally tolerated as part of festival celebration. Certain festivals had specific traditions that broke normal social rules. During the Anthesteria, a festival for Dionysus held in early spring, the second day was called shows, jugs. Everyone, including women and slaves, received a jug of wine and competed to see who could drain it fastest. Even small children participated, receiving their own miniature jugs. For one day, The normal restrictions loosened, and drinking became a communal, almost democratic activity. Some festivals included elements we might call carnivalesque, moments when the social order inverted or dissolved. Slaves might be given temporary freedom, women might participate in ways usually forbidden to them, crude humor and mockery were permitted. These were releases, ways for social pressure to dissipate without threatening the overall structure of society. The dramatic performances at the Dionysia, particularly the comedies, could be remarkably crude and direct. Aristophanes' plays included phallus jokes, fart jokes, extended scenes of characters defecating or urinating. They mocked politicians by name, made fun of philosophers, featured gods behaving badly. This was sacred theater, performed in honor of a god, yet it was also profane, vulgar, wickedly funny. Women had their own festivals, events where men were excluded and women gathered to celebrate female deities. The Thesmophoria, a festival for Demeter, involved 3 days of women's rites. We don't know all the details, men weren't allowed, and women didn't write about it, but we know it included fasting, sacrifice, and elements of fertility magic. These were women's spaces, rare opportunities for female citizens to gather without male supervision. Public festivals served multiple purposes. They honored the gods, certainly. Piety was real and important. But they also created community, giving citizens a shared experience, shared memories, shared identity. They redistributed wealth, at least temporarily, through the meat of sacrifices. They provided entertainment, spectacle, release. And they reinforced social bonds while occasionally allowing those bonds to stretch or even briefly break. When we think of how Greeks partied, we need both models: the exclusive symposium and the inclusive festival, the private and the public, the controlled and the chaotic. Greeks understood that different occasions called for different kinds of celebration, different ways of being together. When Greeks gathered to celebrate, whether at private symposia or public festivals, they didn't just eat and drink. They played, competed, performed, and entertained each other in ways that ranged from refined to ridiculous. Understanding these entertainments gives us a more complete picture of what ancient parties actually felt like. We've already mentioned katabos, the symposium drinking game where men flicked wine dregs at a target. This sounds trivial, but it appears constantly in ancient sources. Vase paintings show men in mid-flick, carefully angling their cups. Poets mention it. It clearly mattered, and not just as a way to pass time. Katabos allowed for showing off, demonstrating skill, grace, and control even while drunk. It created friendly competition. And because players would often dedicate their throws to someone they desired, it became a way to flirt, to declare interest, to perform courtship. Other symposium games were more verbal. There were riddles, puzzles, tests of wit and knowledge. Sympotic poetry was both performance and competition. Men would take turns singing, either composing on the spot or reciting verses they knew, trying to outdo each other in cleverness or beauty. These weren't casual performances. There were rules about what kind of verses suited different moments, what meters were appropriate, what themes were expected. One game involved singing scholion, drinking songs that went around the circle in a particular pattern. You'd sing a verse, then pass a branch of myrtle to someone else, not the person next to you, but someone across the circle, creating a complex pattern. The challenge was to know enough songs, to sing well, to maintain the rhythm. Failing was embarrassing, a sign of poor education or lack of culture. Conversation itself was a kind of game, a performance. Plato's dialogues, set at symposia, show how men would propose topics and take turns speaking, building on or challenging each other's ideas. This wasn't aimless chat. It was structured, almost ritualized. You were expected to be clever, to have insights, to reference poetry and mythology appropriately. Your reputation could be enhanced or damaged by how well you spoke. At public festivals, entertainment was more spectacular. Athletic competitions drew huge crowds. The Olympics were the most famous, but they were only one of several major games. Athletes competed naked, their bodies oiled and gleaming. Wrestling matches could be brutal. Boxing was even worse. Fighters wore leather straps wrapped around their fists, sometimes studded with metal, and fought until one man surrendered or couldn't continue. The crowd screamed approval or derision. Winners became celebrities, received prizes, sometimes had statues erected in their honor. Theatrical performances at festivals like the Dionysia were major events. The theater could hold thousands, perhaps 14,000 at Athens' Theater of Dionysus. The performance began at dawn and lasted all day. Tragedies came first, 3 from one playwright, followed by a comic satyr play. Then comedies. The audience sat on stone benches, exposed to sun and weather, eating snacks, drinking wine, watching stories of gods and heroes unfold. But the audience wasn't passive. They reacted vocally, cheering, booing, hissing. If they disliked a performance, they'd make it known. If they loved it, the theater would thunder with applause. The plays competed for prizes, judged by selected citizens. Winning was prestigious for the playwright and the citizen who had funded the production. Losing was very public failure. Music was everywhere at Greek gatherings. The aulos, a double-piped reed instrument often translated as flute, provided a penetrating, vibrant sound. The lyre and kithara, stringed instruments, offered sweeter, more delicate tones. Professional musicians performed, but so did amateurs. Being able to play an instrument, or sing well, was a mark of proper education, at least for men of a certain class. Dancing happened too, though Greek dance was different from what we might imagine. Some dances were processional, moving through streets during festivals. Others were more athletic, war dances where men in armor performed complex, vigorous movements. Women danced at their own festivals, though we have less information about those performances. And there were less respectable dances, the kind that happened late at symposia or during komos, when inhibitions had dissolved and movements became more suggestive. Even seemingly simple activities had depth. Conversation at a symposium wasn't just talk, it was a chance to demonstrate your education, your wit, your familiarity with the cultural touchstones that defined Greek identity. A drinking game wasn't just a game, it was performance, competition, courtship, and display all at once. Greeks didn't have television, recorded music, smartphones, or any of the entertainment technologies we take for granted. They had each other, their bodies, their voices, and their collective knowledge of stories and songs. They had to create their own entertainment, and they did so with creativity and intensity that might surprise us. Not every Greek gathering ended well. Despite all the rules, rituals, and social expectations designed to contain celebration within acceptable bounds, things often went wrong. Parties ended in fights, in public humiliation, in damaged friendships, in regret. The gap between ideal and reality was wide, and understanding what happened when Greeks partied too hard tells us something important about their society and human nature. Greek literature is full of warnings about excessive drinking. We've mentioned Eubulus's catalogue of kraters, but he wasn't alone. Medical writers like Hippocrates discussed the physical effects of drunkenness: nausea, headache, trembling, confusion. Philosophers worried about the moral effects, how wine could lead to actions one would normally avoid, to speech one would normally restrain, to revelation of character defects normally hidden. And history provided examples. Alcibiades, that brilliant, charismatic, infuriating figure, was infamous for his symposium behavior. Beyond the incident in Plato's dialogue, other sources describe him showing up drunk at parties, causing disruptions, making inappropriate speeches. His political career was damaged partly by his inability to control himself at drinking parties, where he made enemies and alarmed potential allies. One night in 415 BC, as Athens was preparing to launch a massive expedition to Sicily, someone mutilated the Hermi, stone markers with the god Hermes' head and an erect phallus, placed throughout the city. Dozens of them were vandalized, their faces smashed, their phalluses broken off. The city was horrified. This wasn't just vandalism, it was sacrilege. And suspicion fell on Alcibiades and his drinking companions. The implication was that a drunken Komos had gone too far, had escalated from mischief to something darker. We hear about other symposium violence. Arguments over politics or personal matters, fueled by wine, could turn physical. Men might grab whatever was at hand, cups, furniture, even the spits used for roasting meat, and use them as weapons. The same space that fostered philosophical discussion could also host brawls. Sexual assault was a real problem. We have to read between the lines of ancient sources, but it's clear that the presence of slave women and hetairai at symposia sometimes led to non-consensual situations. The power imbalances were stark, and intoxicated men with social power could behave badly toward women with none. Ancient writers occasionally condemned such behavior, but more often they passed over it in silence or treated it as unremarkable. The Komos, that drunken processional through the streets, could tip from festive to dangerous. Groups of young men, masked or garlanded, singing and drinking as they wandered, might harass passers-by, damage property, or start fights with other groups. There are accounts of Komos participants breaking down doors, demanding to be let into houses where they weren't invited, making noise through the night. The Athenians had laws about hubris, outrageous, shameful behavior, and some of these laws specifically addressed drunken misconduct. You could be prosecuted for what you did at a party, for how you treated slaves or free persons, for property damage or assault. The laws existed because the problems were real and recurring. Morning after scenes appear in comedy. Characters wake up hungover, trying to piece together what they did the night before, discovering with horror that they made fools of themselves or offended someone important. These scenes work as comedy because audiences recognize the situation, had experienced it or witnessed it themselves. There's a famous story about Alexander the Great, himself notorious for excessive drinking, killing his friend Clitus at a party. The two were drinking heavily, arguing about Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. Alexander, drunk and enraged, grabbed a spear from a guard and ran Clitus through. The horror of what he'd done sobered him immediately. He was devastated, reportedly tried to kill himself, and fell into deep depression for days. But Clitus was still dead, killed over drunken argument by a friend who, in any other state, would have protected him. These stories matter because they reveal the stakes. Greek parties weren't harmless fun. They were spaces where reputations could be destroyed, where violence could erupt, where decisions made under wine's influence had lasting consequences. The elaborate social structures around drinking existed precisely because Greeks understood the danger. Yet they kept gathering. They kept drinking. The risks didn't stop them. Perhaps because the benefits, the connection, the pleasure, the inspiration, the joy, seemed worth it. Or perhaps because the social pressure to participate was too strong. Or perhaps because, like people in every culture and every era, they believed that excess was something that happened to others, that they themselves could handle it, that this time would be different. The gap between how Greeks thought they should party and how they actually partied reminds us that human nature is complicated, that we're often not as rational or controlled as we'd like to believe, and that societies across time have struggled with the same basic problems around intoxication, celebration, and the boundary between pleasure and harm. When we step back from the details, the wine ratios, the Katabos games, the philosophical debates, the violence and excess, what does the Greek symposium tell us? What meaning does this peculiar institution hold? The symposium was, in many ways, the center of Greek male social life. It was where friendships were formed and maintained, where political alliances were negotiated, where cultural values were transmitted and reinforced. A man's education was partly measured by how well he performed at symposia, whether he knew the right poetry, could hold his wine, could contribute intelligent conversation, could navigate the complex social dynamics. Many of the most important texts in Western culture emerged from or were set at symposia. Plato's Symposium and Phaedrus, Xenophon's Symposium, fragments of poetry from Sappho and Alcaeus, countless references in comedy and tragedy, all of these grew out of drinking parties. The connection between wine and creativity, between social gathering and intellectual production, was real for the Greeks. But the symposium also reveals the limitations and contradictions of Greek society. It was democratic in the sense that all citizens, wealthy and modest, could host or attend symposia, could participate in this crucial social institution. Yet it excluded women, slaves, foreigners. It created equality within a narrow circle while reinforcing inequality beyond it. The mixing of wine stands as a central metaphor. Greeks believed in mixing, in finding balance, in avoiding the extremes of total sobriety or complete drunkenness. This principle extended beyond wine to their entire worldview. The ideal Greek life was about balance, courage mixed with wisdom, passion with restraint, individual excellence with civic duty. They didn't always achieve this balance. Often they failed spectacularly. But the ideal mattered, shaped how they thought about themselves and their world. The symposium also tells us something about the universal human desire to gather, to celebrate, to temporarily step outside ordinary life. Every culture has developed its own forms of celebration, its own ways of coming together to eat, drink, and experience joy. The Greek version was particular to their time and place, shaped by their values and structures. But the impulse behind it is one we recognize. We still create spaces, bars, clubs, dinner parties, festivals, where we gather with selected others, where we consume substances that alter our consciousness, where we hope to find connection, pleasure, and perhaps meaning. We still struggle with the same tensions, between control and release, between structure and spontaneity, between inclusion and exclusion. We still face the same risks, excess, violence, regret. We still hope for the same rewards, friendship, insight, joy. The Greek symposium is distant from us in time, alien in many of its particulars. The social world that produced it is gone. We wouldn't want to recreate it, with its exclusions and hierarchies and casual acceptance of slavery. But we can recognize something familiar in it nonetheless, that human need to come together, to celebrate, to mark important moments, to create spaces separate from everyday obligations where different rules apply. When the evening ended, when the symposiasts finally rose from their couches and made their way home through darkened streets, perhaps still singing, perhaps contemplating what had been said and done, perhaps nursing the beginning of a headache, they carried with them the memory of the gathering. The words exchanged, the ideas explored, the connections made or reinforced. And in the morning, despite any regrets or discomfort, they would likely look forward to the next invitation, the next opportunity to gather and drink and talk late into the night. The symposium endured for centuries, evolving but never disappearing, because it fulfilled something important. It created community. It provided pleasure. It made space for the intellectual and creative work that we still value. And it offered, within its limitations, a vision of the good life. Friends gathered together, wine flowing, conversation ranging across philosophy and poetry and politics, laughter echoing off painted walls. This is what parties were for, in ancient Greece and perhaps always, not just escape or entertainment, but the creation of shared experience, of memory, of meaning. The Greeks understood that how we celebrate together matters, that the rituals of gathering shape who we are and how we see ourselves. And so the symposium remains with us, not as something to copy but as something to consider, a reminder that humans have always sought ways to come together, to find joy in each other's company, to create moments that transcend the ordinary. The details change across time and culture. The fundamental need does not. We've walked through the doors of ancient houses, reclined on those cushioned couches, watched as wine was mixed and poured. We've listened to philosophical debates and drunken songs, witnessed games and violence, celebration and excess. We've seen the symposium in its complexity, refined and crude, exclusive and intimate, structured and spontaneous, inspiring and troubling. The reality of how ancient Greeks partied turns out to be more complicated than either myth would suggest. They weren't constantly engaged in philosophical discussion about the nature of truth, though that did happen. They weren't perpetually drunk and disorderly, though that happened too. They were humans, trying to find pleasure and meaning, creating elaborate social structures to shape and contain their celebrations, succeeding sometimes and failing others. The distance between our world and theirs is vast. We can never fully understand what it felt like to be there, to experience those gatherings as they did. But we can recognize the human constants, the desire to gather, to drink, to talk, to laugh, to mark important moments, to step briefly outside ordinary life into spaces where different rules apply. The Greek symposium is gone. But something of its spirit remains, in every dinner party where conversation flows late into the night, in every celebration where friends gather to mark joy or sorrow, in every moment when we come together and find, however briefly, connection and meaning. That, perhaps, is the real legacy, not the specific customs or rules, but the understanding that how we celebrate together matters, that these gatherings shape us, and that the human need for community, pleasure, and shared meaning persists across centuries and cultures. Rest well, and may your own gatherings be filled with good company, good conversation, and just enough wine, properly mixed, of course.